Hey, it's Pivotal here. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, listen, we've got the brightest and best, Mr. Will Ford. Thank you so much for joining Pivotal Times today.
Oh, Pamela, thank you so much. Thank you so much
It's
for
been
allowing me to be a part of your program.
Absolutely. It's been a long time coming. I've been trying to get you on the show for like a year, and I'm just really, really excited that God opened that door for us. Let me tell the audience a little bit about who you are. Now, Will Ford formerly served as director of the Marketplace Leadership Major at Christ for the Nations in beautiful Dallas, Texas. He and his wife, his beautiful wife, De Havilland, live in Fort Worth, Texas, with four extraordinary children. I'm here because he has a story to tell as we look at this thing called slavery, and we've been examining it over the years, and definitely in this season. I want to look at the legacy that slavery has left on the personal imprint it's left on our lives. Will is here to talk about how slavery actually impacted his life and how it impacted the lives of those around him. Will, I want to open the floor. You tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, well, for me, the whole journey starts with this kettle pot that I saw in the backyard of my grandmother's house. I was 16 years old, and she said, "Well, you see that pot in the backyard?" And I was like, what pot?" And she said, "The one that's sticking up out of the backyard, halfway sticking up, got the flour in it, half of it's up, the other half is under the ground." I said, "I don't see it." And she said, "Boy, I know you see that blankety blank pot." So my grandmother was kind of like my dad, right? She's sweet, but she'll cuss you out and then she'll quote some scripture every now and then. So anyway, she wasn't that bad. But anyway, so finally I saw what she was talking about, and she said, "God's going to use you with that pot someday." I said, what's the big deal about that pot?" She said, "Well, that pot was used by the slaves in our family. They used it for cooking, but secretly they used it for prayer." And then she said this: "They didn't think they would see freedom in their time, so they prayed for the freedom of their children and their children's children." Right. So that's what she told me. So the next day, I sat down with my dad and I said, "Daddy," and the grandmother told me about this pot in the backyard. He said, "Oh, I know all about that pot." He said, "When I was 5 years old, when we were living in Lake Providence, my dad was a sharecropper and we lived on this farm. And when I was 5 years old, I used to wash clothes in that pot." He said, "We wouldn't, uh, we were poor. We, of course, didn't have a washing machine, and we couldn't even afford a washboard." He said, "But my feet were the agitators for the clothes washing. So I would wash clothes in that pot, and I would trump the clothes with my feet." And he said, as I would do that, my great great grandmother, Harriet Lockett, would tell me the stories of how that pot was used, not just for cooking and washing clothes, but it was also used for prayer. She said what they would do during that time period is they would sneak into a barn late at night to make sure their prayer meeting wasn't seen. He said the irony is that they wanted slaves to be Christians because they knew that Christian slaves made better workers. That's what they would teach around this time period. But for the best scholarship on this says that for the first 120 years or so, from 1619 to like 1740, it was not popular for the enslaved to even hear the gospel, and it was not popular for anybody to find out if they were Christians beforehand. But I'll get into that a little bit later. But around this time period, this is what was told to them on this plantation, that they wanted the slaves to be Christians because by this time they were thinking slaves make better workers. But on this plantation, they didn't want them to pray, and they didn't want them to read. They didn't want them to read because they didn't want them to read the Bible. They didn't want them to pray because they felt like prayer would foster hope. And if they got hopeful, they felt like they would try to run away. So on that plantation with that a great uncle, this is how bad slavery was. I'll give an example. But a great uncle named Willie who went fishing without asking. And the slave masters decided to make an example out of him. So they strapped him to a tree and put both arms and legs around either side of that tree. Then they took a leather strap, which was shredded, which had rocks and nails and glass attached to it, something like the cat of nine tails. And they beat this slave forefather of ours until all the flesh was put off his back. The family, in an effort to save his life, put lard or grease on his sheet and wrapped it around his body to stop the flow of the blood. But in spite of their efforts and because of the cruelty, he bled to death and died. So that's how cruel slavery was in this plantation. And if these folks were caught praying, they would be beaten as well. But in spite of the danger and because of their love for Jesus, these folks risked their lives to pray. Anyway, so what they would do is they would go into a barn late at night to make sure that prayer meeting wasn't seen. But to make sure the prayers weren't heard, they used that cast iron pot. So what they would do is they would take the pot into the middle of the cabin floor, as my father was told by his great grandmother. They take the pot and then they turn it upside down on the cabin floor. Then they prop it up by 3 or 4 rocks on the edges so it'd be suspended off the ground about an inch or two. They would then prostrate themselves on the ground so their lips would be in between the opening between the ground and the kettle, so that the kettle pot muffle their voices as they pray through the night. And the story they passed down with the pot is this, is that they didn't think they would see freedom in their time. So they prayed for the freedom of their children and the next generation. Mm-hmm. So one day freedom comes, there's this young teenage girl, she decides to keep this pot and that story in our family. And well, why would she do that? She's probably thinking about all those who are dead and gone, who risked their lives to pray for her. She's probably thinking about all those who are too old to enjoy the freedom she's about to embrace. So she keeps that pot and that story in our family, and she passed the pot and the story down to Harriet Lockett. Harriet Lockett passed it on to Nora Lockett. Nora Lockett passed it on to William Ford Sr., who passed it on to William Ford Jr., who then gave it to me, William Ford III. And so to give you guys understanding what this pot looks like, this is the pot, all the prayers that were represented from that time period on until slavery comes to an end. It's a powerful reminder of the power of prayer.
I want to put a pause in it and kind of look at what impact that has had on the power of intercessory prayer, but also the persecution that has come along with it, right? At segment 2, we'll go ahead and look at where that pot led you to. But at this segment, I want to kind of deal with just the legacy of persecution, because I think we don't necessarily always see it as persecution in this country. We kind of chalk it up to the slave period, right? But it was a level of persecution that was involved for prayer, for actually standing for the gospel. Can you elaborate on some of those stories for us?
During this time period, a lot of people think that slavery or Christianity, people think that Christianity was actually beaten into the enslaved. And honestly, it wasn't. Back during this time period, they didn't want, especially 1619 on, they didn't want people to be Christians because they were afraid of what the gospel would do to the human heart. And so it was a policy that they had in place from the Brits to the Portuguese and also to the Dutch. They had a policy in place that they didn't want to enslave Christians, which honestly what they were saying is they didn't want to enslave Europeans.
Right.
And so, but the slave traders themselves, they thought, well, we don't want this kind of thinking to be augmented to the people we're actually enslaving, these Black folks that are coming from Africa. Well, what if they find out these folks are Christians? Because to be quite honest, in Congo, they were introduced to Christianity around 1491. Right. When the king of Congo, he gets saved. Well, he had 8 nobles that went to Portugal on their own will, free trade agreements they were working on. They spent a year and a half there, and they hear the gospel from a bishop who teaches them Portuguese. They teach them their language, Kakongo. But in that, he shares the gospel with them. They get saved. They get baptized. They go back to Congo, share the gospel with the king. He gets saved. He has a baptismal service with great pomp, circumstance. His son gets saved, Alfonso I. And they eventually start a school, have about 1,000 people in it. They have catechism, they had curriculum, they had structure, and so all that to say, for about 200 years, up to the time of 1619, Congo had been a Christian nation for that long, and they didn't just stay amongst the elites. The best scholarship on it from John Thornton and Linda Haywood suggests that it went throughout the entire nation. Of course, you still have people who are part of African traditional religions and other things, but Congo becomes a Christian nation for about 200 years up to that time period.
One of the things that in our conversations that led me to this interview was the fact that you tend to see history from the perspective of intercession and from the perspective of what God has done and what God is still doing. And that did not just start when we hit the shores here. It didn't just start when we got Emancipation Proclamation came through, that there was a through line of Christ prior to being on those ships. So one of the things that in doing some research, and this, by the way, is a really great resource. It's called Urban Apologetics by Eric Mason. And
Yes, I
one of
love
the
that
things,
book.
it's awesome. One of the things he talks about is a gentleman named George Lyle, who was like
Yes,
the first licensed person of color to preach the gospel in Georgia. And the persecution that he went through, being arrested, he was born in slavery. When his master died, he went and fought with the British and died in the war. He freed, he got free, and then they tried to bring him back into slavery. So one of the people that he discipled, Mr. Andrew Bryan, actually
yes,
started a number of churches throughout the area. And one of the things that, when Andrew got arrested, one of his statements was, I rejoice not only to be whipped, but would freely suffer death for the cause of Jesus Christ. That's a different way of looking at history, right? It's
yes,
not just that people were going through and that religion was forced down their throats, but some
right.
of them were willing to go through because of the faith that they had and suffering for the sake of the gospel and doing it a biblical way. So what do you say in the face of, because our audience doesn't know what happened with the pot, but
Yeah.
what was some of the things that you had to overcome in your walk with Christ, knowing this history and having this piece of tangible history with you? What were some of the challenges that you had with forgiving, with actually allowing the gospel to do its work?
When I was like 13 years old, going into a convenience store with three other friends, and a carload full of white guys we didn't know. They didn't know us. They probably just joyriding, but listen, they start shouting the N-word at us, said they're going to shoot and kill us, chased us for almost 2 hours. I know what it's like also to get my first nice house in the suburbs in my 30s and have the same police officer every week pull me over just for driving while black. I know what that feels like. But what I realized is I put those stories and other narratives on every person that I saw, whether it was a police officer or whether it was a white person, and especially in that community. Basically, I prejudge people, and that's what the devil wants us to do. It's Revelation 12, where it says the devil is the accuser of the brethren. The word accuser comes from this powerful Greek word. It's the Greek word kategoros, where we get the word category. So the bait of the enemy is to get us to categorize or stereotype each other. So before we have one conversation with each other, we put some bad narrative, some bad storyline on each other. Because when the pot was passed down to me, honestly, Pivotal, it wasn't passed down to me to say we were victims, we're still victims, this is how it's going to be. When the pot was passed down to me, it was in this whole light of we are victorious. This is how we overcame, and this is how we want to overcome today. It's through prayer, it's through our faith, it's through our relationship with Jesus, and God's going to give us a redemptive way of turning history around and make us problem solvers to society. And so that's how it was always passed down to me. But I did have my own things to overcome, but because of that, just the faithfulness of these people who prayed in my family, it gave me the strength, it gave me the courage to, look hatred straight in the face and come in the opposite spirit of love to conquer it over and over again.
So I think what you're saying is so key, because oftentimes in circles, whether it's right wing or left wing, this conversation comes up of victimhood and the idea that when we begin to talk about the realities of oppression, that we're claiming victim. And I love that you pointed out that no, remembering and the narrative of conquering is what was passed down, that we can actually remember the things that happened from a redemptive viewpoint. Not I was a victim, but because I was a conqueror, you're here today. And I think that's extremely important. In segment 2, we're going to look at what that pot represents and how it came full circle. Both you and I were in the AUC, which is the Atlanta University Center. And, you were at Morehouse at different time periods, but I was at Spelman. And, there was a lot that we were passed down historically, being in an HBCU, about Christianity that we're going to look at as well. But one of the things that wasn't passed, unfortunately, though a lot of these schools were grounded and founded in faith, one of the narratives that wasn't passed down was the fact that it started long before we hit these shores, was the fact that we can own it as our own. It wasn't something that was forced. We don't have to flee Christianity, because it is ours. He died for us. I think I'm grateful that both of us were able to come out of that narrative and understand that, no, this is truth, and it's a redemptive gospel. It's not one that hides and runs from the truth.
Listen, Christianity was not beat into the enslaved. On the contrary, the enslaved were beat for being Christians. And so you had this group of people who came over here, one who had already heard the gospel, not just in Congo, but also in Ghana and other places, come over here who are already Christian. Yes, 20% of people who came over here were Muslims. The overwhelming majority of people who came over were part of African traditional religions. But then there was another group of people that, yes, they were believers. They show up. And because of names, most scholars know that some of them probably baptized and given Christian names. Then also, there's another group of Congolese Christians that came to what is now New York. They got here in 1630. They get their freedom in 1640. They buy land, property, houses. They become entrepreneurs. One runs for legislature. And these people were believers. So here's the deal. Before the Great Awakenings happened, it was these people who were sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ when the fake slave religion was going on, that was either suppressing the gospel or persecuting people for preaching the gospel to the enslaved, and then eventually giving a perverted legalistic gospel. It was these people who were enslaved Christians, and also some of them were white abolitionists and revivalists who risked their lives. It was those people that preserved true Christianity in this nation, in the invisible institution. They preserved it long enough so that the whole nation warred against itself to set the people free, that Jesus wanted to be free.
And you know, that's a perfect way to end, because you just talked about the invisible institution. I'm going to read this quote, also in Urban Apologetics. Leaders within the invisible institution equip their flock to discern the difference between the truth of the Christian faith and the manipulation that they were taught by slaveholders. So we're not saying that there was not a manipulative Christianity passed down. I think that's more than obvious. What we are saying is that there was another narrative brewing that often gets hidden, that gets pushed out of the history books. The fact that there was a relationship to Christ for a lot of people that came with them, and for those that got converted and came into the gospel, it was then their responsibility to actually pass a narrative of exodus, of freedom, of justice, and that happened too. So this whole concept that, you know, white people were giving us a narrative of a white savior, yes, that was going on. That wasn't the only thing. And I think that's very important as we pass down these stories to our children, so that we can redeem the gospel, so that it can remain pure, it can remain just, and it can remain staying and constant. Thank you so much for your time. You don't want to miss segment 2, because the pot wasn't just passed down. God brought it full circle, which we'll find out that we're at a cliffhanger right now. We're at pivotal times where we bow before God and stand before man. Thank you so much for watching.